In 1875, Dublin would experience one of the most devastating fires in its entire history. It was a fire unlike any other.
Really? What makes this one so special?
I was just getting to that, Gagi. You see, the fire would spread to a warehouse containing 5,000 barrels of whiskey, and the barrels, well, they exploded, unleashing an almighty river of flaming whiskey into the streets of Dublin. This is the true story of the Dublin whiskey fire. Now, as I'm sure you've guessed, our story takes us to Dublin, Ireland. It's June 1875 and the Irish whiskey industry was positively booming. And Dublin was the centre of it all. Interestingly, the business of storing barrels of whiskey was particularly lucrative. You see, in 1823, the Whiskey Excise Act was passed, and up until this point, well, there was a lot of illicit whiskey being produced. And this act, well, it aimed to stop all of that and make it far more attractive to do things legally. Of course, the government wanted in on those sweet whiskey profits, and as usual, they would get their share through taxes. Now, this act changed many things, but of particular significance to our story is that it changed when the taxes on whiskey production were due. They were now only payable when the whiskey became available for sale, not when it was barrelled and stored for maturation. So, enter commercial bonders. Distillers would pay these commercial bonders a tiny sum to store their whiskey barrels in a bonded warehouse. Now, Mr. Lawrence Malone was a bigwig, the biggest wig in fact, when it came to the bonded warehouse game. He set up a huge warehouse right in the middle of Dublin, and the top distillers, Jameson's, Rose and Greenmount to name a few, would pay him to store their barrels of whiskey. And Lawrence, well, he certainly didn't do things by halves. He would store mountains of whiskey, at least 1 million litres, and my goodness, was this stuff highly flammable. You see, the whiskey was very potent. It hadn't been diluted to the extent that bottled whiskey usually is. Lawrence's flourishing business had set the stage for a truly devastating disaster. The 18th of June 1875 was a beautiful summer's day. At 4:45 p.m, Lawrence's warehouse had been checked over and everything was ship-shape. Within just a few hours though, things would take a turn for the worse. Now, no one knows what happened, how the fire started, but at around 8 p.m, an alarming noise filled the air. Pigs frantically squealing at the top of their lungs. Their cries were so loud that they certainly couldn't be ignored. Something was dreadfully wrong.
Wait, pigs in the city?
Well, yeah, lots of people kept livestock back then. It was a good way to make a little bit of extra money. There'd have been pigs, donkeys, horses, goats, you name it. Anyway, those pigs, well, they quite possibly saved the day. They'd raised the alarm by squealing their little hearts out. The malt house next to Lawrence's warehouse was ablaze, and sadly for those little piggies, the flames had spread to their pigsty. Lawrence's warehouse was also on fire, and soon sheets of flame up to 30 feet high were seen bursting out of the roof. The flames were so bright, so intense that their glow could be seen for miles around. On seeing those brilliant, terrifying flames, crowds inevitably started to gather, some eager to make sure that their loved ones were safe, others just there for the spectacle. Dublin's fledgling fire brigade was notified as soon as that fire was spotted, and within 10 minutes, 15 firemen arrived at the scene, under the command of the very capable Captain James Robert Ingram. Now, he was the founder of the Dublin Fire Department and was smart, experienced and resourceful. He was also known for his rather unconventional firefighting tactics. Once there was a ship engulfed by flames drifting into the Dublin harbour. How did he deal with this? Well, he ordered the Royal Navy to sink it. Anyway, back to today's calamity. The fire, it was spreading rapidly, and Captain Ingram could sense that things were about to get much worse. They needed backup, and lots of it. So he called for hundreds of soldiers and police officers to help. Captain Ingram's fears would soon be realised. Those barrels of whiskey inside Lawrence's warehouse, well, they were ready to blow. At around 9:30 p.m, pops and bangs could be heard as barrel after barrel exploded, each unleashing around 250 litres of whiskey. It was a frightening sound, almost like artillery fire. the torrents of highly flammable whiskey, they were set alight, producing dazzling blue flames, adding fuel to the already raging fire and causing more and more barrels to explode, a seemingly never-ending cycle. Then, to top it all off, the flaming whiskey began flowing out of every single crevice of the warehouse. First it was a trickle, then a stream, and soon a hissing river of lava-like whiskey. It rushed through the streets and the narrow alleyways, setting anything in its path ablaze. According to the Irish Examiner, the streets resembled canals of flame and the faint odour of burning whiskey could be smelt for miles. The old wooden houses lining the nearby Chamber Street, Ardee Street and Mill Street didn't stand a chance. Entire rows of houses were soon consumed by flames. At one point, it looked like the fire was going to spread to the Carmelite convent and a nearby orphanage. But what luck, the wind changed direction. An act of God, the nuns said. But the people living on the opposite side of the street would have definitely disagreed with those nuns. The wind had spread the fire onto their homes instead. Sparks then flew onto the scaffolding around the Coombe Hospital, but miraculously it escaped unscathed. A large tannery in Mill Street wasn't as fortunate though. It quickly went up in flames and thick black smoke was billowing out of it, adding to the already terrible assault on the senses. Within a few hours, the building was reduced to a pile of ash. The fire took hold of a public house on Chamber Street. The owner, Mr. Lawrence Fitzsimmons, lived above the pub and the poor man had been bedridden for quite a few years now. He was trapped inside and it certainly wasn't looking good for him. A panicked crowd gathered outside, unsure of what to do as the flames grew in intensity, engulfing more and more of the building. Finally, and thank goodness, 2 brave soldiers arrived. They would try and rescue him. They fought their way through the fire and grabbed Mr. Fitzsimmons. They managed to drag him out of the burning building. The 2 heroes were, quite rightly, met with applause from the crowd. Mr. Fitzsimmons had been saved. A few doors down, a wake was taking place. A group were mourning the death of their dear friend. The fire was rapidly advancing down the street and soon the flames began lapping at their house too. The group realised that they needed to evacuate. The wake? Well, it would have to wait. They picked up the body of their dear friend and frantically rushed out of the house. All around, terrified residents were fleeing their homes, some dazed and half-dressed, some clutching babies, while the frail and the elderly were carried out of burning homes by their friends and relatives. Barely escaping with their lives, they all watched in horror as everything they owned, everything that they had worked for, burned to the ground. Anger and resentment grew among the crowd. Why weren't the fire brigade using their engines to put out the blaze? The issue was that water couldn't be used here. Captain Ingram knew that water would just fan the flames. The burning whiskey would simply float to the top and spread further and further. Earlier, some well-meaning members of the public had tried to douse the fire with water, and their actions did far more harm than good. It wasn't long before loud bangs could be heard underneath them. The water had carried the flaming whiskey into the sewers. Sewers that were filled with some wonderfully putrid gases. It all made for quite the explosive combination. Captain Ingram needed something to make a barrier. He needed to stop the flaming whiskey in its tracks. Only then could they contend with the burning houses. He and his team hadn't just been idly standing by though. Oh no, they'd been formulating a plan. He ordered the soldiers to rip up the paving stones on the streets and also gather some sand and tan from the nearby establishments. The soldiers then set to work making barriers out of the salvaged materials. But alas, it didn't work. The burning liquid found its way through the sand and the fire raged on, seemingly unstoppable. A Mr. Manders owned a number of horses and was frantically trying to get them to safety. As he led them through Cork Street, one of them, quite understandably, spooked and galloped off into the flames. Other animals followed suit. It was utter chaos. Escaped horses, pigs and donkeys and dogs stampeding all over the place. Some of the poor things on fire. Many of the pigs were scorched black. In the aftermath, one of the dogs, either rabid or suffering from alcohol withdrawal, gave a man called William Eyre quite the fright. The dog, foaming at the mouth, its eyes wild and its teeth bared, rushed into William's home. It charged about, knocking over furniture, and then it lunged at William. He quickly grabbed an iron bar and brandished it at the dog. Thankfully, the dog backed down. Sadly, the dog then ran up to the top floor of the house and jumped out of an open window. It didn't survive. The soldiers worked really hard to keep those crowds under control, but there was no stopping them once they worked out that that liquid flowing through the streets was whiskey. They were determined not to let this opportunity pass them by. It was time to drink some flaming whiskey.
Ooh, imagine the deep, smoky flavours. Let's make our own flaming whiskey and sell it. We'll be rich. Gargi's Flaming Whiskey. It's spicy and smoky. Available now for only $99.99. I don't know how money works.
Gargi, I hate to break it to you, but it's sort of already been done. There's already a flaming pig whiskey that's inspired by the disaster. Now, to be honest, I'm not really sure how tasty this street whiskey would have actually been. Remember, there was a lot of livestock in Dublin. Lots of animals means lots of poop in the streets. And I don't know about you, but it's definitely not a cocktail that I'd want to drink. Anyway, the back alleys and lanes were the best place to score some of this free, flaming, poo-tainted whiskey. These areas weren't as well guarded, and here the whiskey was either gently flowing or settling in pools. The crowds used hats, cup hands, bowls and jugs to scoop up the whiskey and drink it as it flowed past. Some were even drinking it by the bootful, and others just lay face down and lapped it up from the floor. Now remember, this was undiluted whiskey, so pretty strong stuff. People were getting very drunk, very quickly, and sadly some were falling unconscious in the streets. Many had to be taken to hospital. It would turn out that it was the whiskey, not the fire, that was deadly. Now, the fire destroyed at least 37 buildings, but it didn't claim a single human life. The whiskey, on the other hand, claimed 13, and they all died from alcohol poisoning. Now, even if the alcohol didn't kill you, in some cases it still had devastating effects. Some were hospitalised for a very long time, and others suffered blindness and brain damage. Somehow, during all of the chaos, around 60 barrels of whiskey had been salvaged from the warehouse. Now, the public's thirst for whiskey was so strong that the barrels needed to be protected by armed soldiers. It's absolutely wild, but the soldiers even had to threaten a mob with a bayonet charge at one point. People wanted the whiskey so badly that they'd resorted to attacking the soldiers. Captain Ingram's first plan had been unsuccessful, but he'd now come up with an even better one. Horse manure. That was the answer. At the time, horses were used for transport. There were so many horses in the city, and as a result, practically an endless supply of manure. He ordered the soldiers to build dams and barriers out of the manure, and it worked. The damp manure soaked up the whiskey, and the flow began to slow. They could now start using the fire engines to put out the fires on the burning buildings. The community really pulled together to get the fire under control and to help those in need. Students from the nearby medical schools helped to man the hoses, whilst others helped to free trapped animals. Soldiers helped to salvage people's belongings and furniture. Sadly, many people had been left homeless by the disaster, but the convent, which had miraculously been spared, offered them shelter. By 4 a.m. the next morning, the fire had finally been snuffed out. Word of the Dublin whiskey fire started to spread all around the world. You see, there were quite a few American and British journalists in town. They were there to cover a rifle match. Now, fires there, pretty common. They happen all over the place. But the journalists really hammed up the bizarreness of the situation. And to be fair, it must have been quite the sight. Animals running around all over the place, squealing pigs on fire, pops and bangs as barrels exploded, the streets, canals of flaming whiskey, and manure saving the day. But the part they really focused on was a story of Irish people being terribly rowdy, scooping whiskey up of the streets and drinking themselves silly, playing into every stereotype. What they didn't mention, though, was the fact that the whiskey was highly concentrated, so it didn't take much for people to find themselves horrifically intoxicated. Dublin became a laughingstock and sadly felt a bit embarrassed, so the disaster was sort of swept under the rug, and the whisky industry wanted to play it down too. I mean, people dying from drinking your product is certainly very bad publicity. It's estimated that the fire caused around £100,000 worth of damage, around £9.6 million in 2024, and £54,000, around £5 million in today's money, relating to the contents of the bonded warehouse. Now, luckily for the warehouse, the malt house and the tannery, they were likely insured. And of course, as always, it was the ordinary folk that would suffer the most. They wouldn't have been insured. They lost absolutely everything they had. The mayor stepped in to try and help though. He started a fundraiser which would turn out to be rather successful, raising hundreds of pounds. The disaster would have a silver lining. Thankfully, as we've seen with a lot of cases on this channel, disasters often spark change. At the time, the Dublin Fire Department was in its relative infancy, and many felt that it was unnecessary, a complete and utter waste of time and money. But this all changed after the Dublin whisky fire. Everyone realised that if it wasn't for Captain Ingram and his men, things would have been much, much worse. The fire department had saved the day. The incident showed just how important it was to have a full-time fire brigade. It also showed distilleries the dangers of storing large volumes of highly flammable spirits. It spurred the whisky industry to adopt fire safety precautions and even establish fire brigades of their own within the distilleries. If you got something from this video, Gaki and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, try to resist the urge to drink highly potent, poop-laced, flaming whisky. And I hope you have a magnificent day.